afternoon. Thank you for joining ULI Hong Kong Forum for New Central webinar. Before we start the section, please remind that you can click on the Q&A button to submit your questions to our panel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tiffany Lau. I'm the Executive Director for ULI Hong Kong. I welcome you all today to the 7th and final installment of our Forum for a New Central webinar series. It's been a great few months talking about all things related to not just the future of our city, but what is possible for our industry as a whole. How can we do things better? How can we make Hong Kong a more resilient and inclusive place that is competitive and exciting and relevant? So today's topic is about public-private partnerships. I can't think of a more fitting topic to end the series with, as the future of our city really depends on not just the collective efforts of our government officials, the private sector, our professional community, but also increasingly the community. So without further ado, I'd like to bring on Andrew MacGeoth, our esteemed panelists, to dive into this very, very important topic. And again, thank you all for tuning in over the course of the last few months. And actually, I'm excited to launch a new website dedicated to this conversation about a new central. The website is newcentral.org. And again, check back with us in the coming weeks and months to expand on this conversation. We just launched an open call for new ideas. So please refer to the website for details on that. And again, thank you. Take it away, Andrew.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Tiffany, for that warm introduction, and delighted to help today. So as you can see from this little slide, I head up Asia Real Estate and Infrastructure here for Brian Cave Leighton Paisner. I've been working quite a number of PPPs in Hong Kong in particular, but also on projects around the region. But delighted to be joined by Donald Choi here on my right, who's CEO of Chinachem Group. But apart from being a great developer and investor, he actually comes with a lot of design background as well and skill in that area. And if you read his bio, he believes in the power of design and architecture to empower society. So there's a grand statement, Donald. So we'll come back into how you're planning to empower us all with some of the projects that you're doing in Hong Kong. But anyway, now CEO of Chinachem, previously MD of Nanfeng Group, also Director of Foster and Partners before, and the AP for the our very wonderful airport in Hong Kong. So and sits on all kinds of trustee boards, including the ULI. I could go on for a very long time, but Donald, thank you for joining us today. On my left here, we have Emily Trusler, who's partner at Ernst & Young and leads the Hong Kong infrastructure advisory business. Also been involved in PPPs around the region, especially in China, ASEAN, Australia, and the Middle East, and focuses a lot on transport and urban development, and including places like the Sydney Metro. So great to have you with us, Emily. And finally, Terence Tarantia, who's head of the Hong Kong, Singapore, and Shenzhen offices of Benoi. Benoi have obviously been very involved in this whole kind of Site 3 development in terms of coming up with some amazing designs. But Terence has also been involved with great projects like the Changi Terminal 4 and the Jewel there, which is truly amazing. If you haven't seen it, I hope one day you'll get there. But also comes from a UK design background, so has a lot of experience to share from an international perspective as well as a local and regional perspective. So as for today, what are we going to try and talk about? So what's the context? When Tiffany first asked me to help moderate, it was trying to talk about PPPs and this balance of public interest with private sector requirements. What models work what's good, what's bad and ugly, or perhaps if we put it more positively, the good, the better, and the best. So let's try and keep it on that side of the line. But look, let's face it, if you just give a piece of land to the private sector, what are they going to do with it? The usual principles may be highest and best use, and how to maximize GFA, which gives the highest and best return, profit, profit, and profit. But thankfully, there are developers here who try to balance this to some degree. But how far will they go? And is it just to the extent of incentives or beyond? So in the last 12 months of COVID, I think it's amplified the dialogue around another set of PPPs, the people, planet, and profit, or prosperity, whichever word you like to use there, which is now sort of commonly being called the triple bottom line. And will the private sector know how to balance these principles, or does the public sector need to dictate these and provide the parameters or the incentives for the developers to do the right thing? So we have in Hong Kong some very important projects coming up. We've got Site 3, which I know we're going to talk about. Central Market, which Donald and China Ken already appointed to work on. So we've got some good case studies. There are plenty of others in the market that Emily will also talk about in terms of how things are going in the region. So just in terms of that backdrop, it's about balancing public and private sector, and how can things be done differently, better, and maybe faster. And I mean, maybe the speed point is where we might start in the context of Central Market, which first appeared on the scene in 2009, when the then CE gave the URA the task of revitalizing that project under the initiative Conserving Central. So I'm sure Tiffany and the team there, they like this concept of not just conserving, but also regenerating and bringing new life. So Donald, help us to understand, why did it take so long to form that consensus on what to do? And was the consultation processes that URA had a help or a hindrance, and how did that kind of guide where we are today?
Right. I think we need to start actually even before 2007. The Central Market was graded Grade 3 historical building back in 1996. So it gave it certain historical significance. So when the market operation was closed down in 2003, the intention to redevelop that site was opposed in the community. So there was various back and forth discussion, and it came to an end when the CE policy addressed make it clear that the site will be handed over to ULA for conservation and revitalization. ULA then actually formed a community advisory group, involving stakeholders in the community, academic, conservation experts, historian, government officials, so on. So in the next 2 years, 2009, 2011, they did a lot of public engagement and surveys, and eventually came up with what they considered to be the perfect plan for the conservation, called the Central Oasis. Really preserving the building, adding a lot of green space, and they actually went through a public open competition. Eventually, Hirosaki, the Japanese architect, was awarded with the contract and for the design, and detailed design was in progress. I don't know how many of you still remember. I think that design eventually was quite interesting, because it's not just the building. They actually add a swimming pool on top, and open up the facade and so on. And again, because of the design process has dragged on for quite a number of years, the final cost estimate came out to be tripling the cost of the original budget. So then by, I think, 2015 to 2017, the whole design went back to the drawing board, and it was decided that we shouldn't be so aggressive, in adding in all of these new features. So the project itself was scaled down. So it just actually really going back to our original conservation and preservation rather than adding in a lot of new elements. Then in 2019, the decision was made to actually ask or outsource the operation out to the private sector. So this is where Chinachem came in 2020. There was a EOI and then shortlisted to proceed with the tender, and then it asked for both financial and kind of a business proposal design submission. So it's a two-envelope system, which I think it do justice to the building, because ULA realized that it shouldn't be just looking at the financial return. It really is how the building can be operated and actually draw in the community. And we are very happy that we were awarded with the contract to operate the central market for 10 years. And obviously, we think that our business proposal and design proposal is the important factor that got us awarded with the contract. So this is a long, track on process, but I think it is better to do it right than rush in and actually do something that we would regret. And I think the proposal that we have with ULA and eventually how the community can be served, I think I have very much confidence that it will offer a new type of 21st century marketplace for the community, not only in terms of serving their daily needs, but also really create a community urban room that they can enjoy. And we call our kind of concept playground for all.
Okay, look, that's really interesting, because the consultation process could have led to the highest and best use of how do you mix a sort of an old building and add on some big new tower or whatever. And Hong Kong community seems to have been quite cautious about those kinds of projects. I mean, even the central police station, which had potential for more of that, ended up getting a bit more scaled down. Anyway, so here we are, we're back to this kind of more community focused, it's conservation, and if we can still call it revitalization, where you are still balancing people, prosperity and planet. And I think that's in line with the Chinachem approach now. Can you tell us more about that balance? How are you going to balance those principles, and are you still going to make a profit, or is it now people, planet, community, and break even? Anyway,
well, definitely, I think economic return is important for any enterprises, because if you do not actually make a profit, then you do not have the resources to do additional projects that could actually contribute back to the community. So in Chinachem, the 3 Ps, people, planet, and prosperity, we look at it not exclusive from each other, but really creating a synergy to actually add value. We do believe in the possibility of shared value creation. It doesn't mean that if we are making commercial success project, then it will be something bad for the community. I think they can be actually on the same path. So for us, as you mentioned, I think probably if you look at the simplest way of making a profit is actually maybe rent the whole place out to a iconic big name luxury brand, Apple, showcase and so on. But that is not what we are doing. I think we believe that in the spirit of the original market, it should really support SME, local brand, the diversity of products, the affordability of the price range is equally important. And we are, despite only 10 years of operation, we think this is a project that could enable Chinachem to demonstrate our ability that contribute back to the community while getting a reasonable return. Therefore, we are looking at it as a long-term project for us. So we are building the networking, the connection, bringing in, we hope over 100, stores operator into the market itself. Again, it's not only the selling and buying. We are actually having a plan to organize community events within the building. So we will, in the next 5 years, organize 250 community events, collaborating with various NGO community group, private enterprises to bring interesting events into the building as well. So it's become really both a place, to serve their daily need, but also kind of a place to entertain themselves, to gather their friends. Because of the 24 hours passageway, there is also opportunity to stay late. So it's not just the 9 to 6 operation or 9 to 9 operations.
Right. So, but then if you've got, say, 100 tenants, obviously maybe of different sizes, balancing that, how many, what proportion is it? 1/3? Is it 25% of small SMEs versus bigger corporates that can afford to pay a more commercial rent that maybe subsidizes the smaller pop-ups or what have you? Any comment on that?
Yeah, I think rather than become the area for because of the size of the corporation or shops, what we are doing is create the tenant mix. So it's really about what percentage of F&B, what percentage of lifestyle, what percentage of daily marketing needs, and so on. So obviously F&B will be a big draw. So that probably will occupy 20-30% of the area. But also because it's open plan concept, which is something that I think is quite unique in our proposition, because a lot of the other business proposal, I think, is subdividing the places into different shops. But we have an open plan, so there are a lot of common area and passageway that can be shared, almost like a department store. So people have that visual connection as well as to be there, to be seen, and see what other activities are doing. Again, I think our also in terms of our lease arrangement, we probably would be more flexible than the typical landlord tenants contract. So it may not be just a 2+1 year fixed contract. We could have pop-up store, we have shorter or longer contracts to facilitate the tenant's operation.
And different rental approaches. So if you've got the pop-up with can't afford a big rental risk, you have maybe different approaches to that.
Yes, one of our intentions is really support a new startup and also smaller local brands. So we have various formula of how the revenue can be shared. So rather than having a fixed rental at day one, probably we will have a more reasonable fixed rental, and then there will be turnover rent depend on the revenue.
Okay, and then how much of this sort of balance between the supporting the local community and local enterprises, how much of that was dictated by URA in the tender documents, or was it entirely your flexibility, your own creative ideas that came up with that? So did you have to meet their expectations? You've exceeded those expectations. Tell us a bit more about that public sector, private sector.
I think there are certain expectations and they are written into the contract. I think after all the consultation periods done, it is quite clear that the community do not want luxury brand store within to be put in. So there are certain requirements. But I think what distinguish our proposal is also we look at the 21st century marketplace. Actually will be assisted by technology. So we are putting in a lot of infrastructure, from POS to different apps, also enabling the premise to be a totally 5G environment. So the tenant actually, when they come in, they do not need to invest a lot in terms of capex and fitting up. They can concentrate on doing their business, and where we will provide all the infrastructure support, and even maybe some mentorship, to the startup to how to conduct their business. And we are in kind of cooperation with Cyberport as well as Hong Kong Science Technology Park to get them to introduce us to their startup and bring in some of their technology into the building itself as a pilot testing ground. So there are a lot of things happening, and we are happy that together with ULA we will be able to demonstrate a new type of retail experience, for the community.
But then is URA kind of putting in KPIs to kind of ensure you keep to those principles? Are they quite strict or reasonably flexible?
Well, actually, we have a joint management committee where ULA and us actually will be monitoring and constantly looking at the business plan of the market itself. So, obviously the operation will be run by us, but I think a lot of each initiative, we welcome ULA comments and suggestions. And, it really is a team spirit. And we intend to also, involve other community groups to give us advice as well.
Well, very best of luck with that, Donald. We know that balancing all of those principles won't always be easy, but it sounds like an innovative approach and as you say, one that will benefit the community. So let's now turn over to the Site 3 project in Central, very famous, particularly with Benoit having lobbied to get some great design ideas out there. So a two-envelope approach, it's prescriptive in some areas, but it's quite open in terms of, well, we're looking at office and retail and dining entertainment. Hotel could have, not compulsory. But one specific thing is public open space, and 25,000 square meters of public open space out of 150,000 square meters. So that's 1/6 of the site is public open space. So Terence, I mean, I don't know whether that's a lot or not enough, but from a design perspective, what does that public open space do to benefit the community? And do you think it's the right amount, or want to comment on that?
I think it's quite interesting that you used 150,000 square meters, but if you look at the land area, it's about 49,000 square meters. So I think 25 is nearly 50%.
Yeah.
So
and it's a grade level, so that's real.
That's right. So there's two grade levels. It's at grade and that's the elevated deck on the landscape deck. I think landscape deck, I think 12,000 has to be at grade, and the rest can be on the elevated deck. So it's interesting because you use 150,000 terms. When you use land area, the plot area is about a bit more than 50%. I think usually when we do projects in many parts of the world, we also have footprint area requirements. It's not too far off. It's slightly more generous. So I don't think that's too much. I think it's workable. What I find quite interesting was there was this a lot of attention on this area, and in reading through the tender document, I didn't see as much a definition as of what exactly do you want to use it for. So just reflecting a little bit on the kind of land tender kind of processes that I experience in many parts of the world, mostly in my home country where I was from, Singapore. I was just reflecting on the tool, and it's quite interesting. Singapore's tender documentation has far lesser words. Your document on this is 664 pages. I didn't read everything, but it has more drawings. And this one has, I think maybe when you add 6 or 7 drawings, the packs that we have is quite thick in the technical condition of drawings, but it's very prescriptive. And what is interesting is usually for a site of this kind of significance, they will define exactly what is this function of the spaces. For example, in Singapore, it's very popular these days to have urban rooms. So the urban rooms in Singapore is basically we're tropical, so it rains all the time and it's hot. So government felt that there needs to be climatically well designed spaces, which is covered free from rain of a certain size for congregational activities in certain parts of the city. So again, that one, they usually is 2,000, 3,000 square meters. Quite small. Yeah. Not small by Singapore standard, but your kind of guidelines here, I was reading the kind of public spaces define those as a minimum 500 meters square. But actually for a city that's so dense, you do need big spaces to congregate and comfortable spaces. So to kind of have the long and short story of it is, I just felt that perhaps it would be better if there was a bit more clarity in the kinds of public spaces that is well suited to the needs of the citizens and dwellers living in Hong Kong that's defined there, which I felt wasn't so clear, and it's a pity because there's this huge figure called 25,000, but you don't exactly know which parts are used for what purpose.
But I guess that's then the difference, isn't it, between say a Hong Kong government approach and a Singapore government approach of this time at least, the Hong Kong government seems to be saying, well, okay, private sector, we'll trust you to come up with what you think is the most creative, best use of that space. And even down to the fact that the commercial aspects are not overly prescriptive. There's quite a lot of flexibility there. But you think perhaps still a bit more direction from government would be valuable?
I think it's because it's very important to understand what the people need.
Yeah.
And I couldn't really see, I couldn't see it in the brief, and that's my problem. So when I look at that, it's great. I mean, I'm a designer. It's great for me when I take a look at this, and it's very descriptive also of the market system. So, but it's outcome based. It's not based on a definition of what you need. So that part was a bit lacking for me. So I felt maybe it should be somewhere in between. In fact, I do feel the ones in Singapore are too prescriptive. We've always joked that by the time you take the prescription, all you do is dress it up and do some nice things. But it's different. I think in Singapore, they have a very clear vision on the interrelationships between public spaces in the city. Here, when I also looked at it, I wasn't very clear on the hierarchy and the roles of the public spaces within the city. There are good examples here, which is quite interesting insofar like central market, which Donald was talking about, which is fantastic. When I came here, I've been always coming to Hong Kong. So over the years, recent trip, there's Tycoon, which is I found that this city had found a few hearts, and those are great projects. And I'm sure Central Market will become, it will definitely become one, as Donald described. It's very interesting. I think the other thing which is very tricky, which I thought the marking system did touch on, is the placemaking and place management. The marking was very low. It was only 8 points. There was a lot of focus on the physical aspect, but your conserving communities, actually the activities are very critical in how you organize. And those form like the software requirements for the hardware. So I felt that one wasn't so clear to me and how and weighted enough.
Right. Yeah, so that's interesting because with the two envelope, and I know a lot of the chambers, in fact, probably ULI and Benoit and others have been very involved in lobbying government to get a more creative approach. And at least within the 50%, it doesn't look as if there's a lot of marks given to. So I think there's 20 marks for quality of architectural and urban design, 32 marks quality of landscaping and attractiveness of public open space. Quite how all of that works out, I don't know. Connectivity and walkability, 16 marks. So, but you're right, only 8 marks to the sort of
the soft spots.
Yeah, but so in terms of overall, there is some quite a lot of focus on the design, connectivity, and the like. Any other examples elsewhere where you've seen different scoring systems, or any other comments that you want to make about that, or do you think this is quite consistent with what you've seen in other markets like Singapore for projects of this type?
It's different in every country because I think it has to do with how you first define the tender conditions and what the marking system does for that. So reflecting again to Singapore, Singapore's marking system is very different. It's 2 envelopes, but we have the first envelope is called pass or minus, which means you could, I mean, they will mark you can higher points, but you don't, it doesn't impact the second.
Right.
The reason, it's a pass or fail. We call it pass or fail, but of course there are better schemes and not so good schemes. And the design review panel or DAP, the design assessment panel will mark it in those sessions. What works for them is because the tender set is so defined in terms of the clear things they need. So usually you will know you get your squares, you get your connectivity, you get your width, you get your range height protection. All those things are very clear. You know those are set within a larger framework of how the city needs to perform with that development. So the pass means you will get those things. There are other things. There are some problems with that because sometimes quality of architecture gets a little bit sort of problem. And then the second phase, the second envelope is then what we call the price envelope. It's all about the price. So it's quite interesting. I mean, in certain instances, we had a design that we felt was nicer, but it got second simply because you know, the price was not as high, right? And some of them involve us doing it, which is quite sad. But anyway, that's why it is. Here it's quite interesting that it probably works in the sense that the weighting is, you have to pass, you need 60 points for your first phase or non-premium submission, and then you can get more points in how you design the quality. So there's a lot of qualitative aspects, and then when you add this to phase submission 2, which is premium, you get the total points. So I would think this is quite good for this scenario. The only question really is who judges the outcome, and that outcome that is judged. Again, question is this what the people or those who, general public as well as those who use the facility, is that what they really want? Or it's, you know, so those then have that kind of discussion to be had. Again, I don't think there's a perfect system, but I think we need to find a system which works for the city. And that process that allows you to finally get to a point whereby it works for the developer or those investing in it, but it also works for those who are using or coming to it, because if it works both ways, like what Antonio was saying, triple bottom line, it should be good for business because more people will want to, community want to come here. You know, when the office is not, commercial is not busy 24/7, you have your weekends. And then you also want to create buzz. So I think that's important to bear in mind when you look at these processes.
Okay. Well, at least then on this project, there has been a lot of, I think, public-private sector dialogue going on before the tender documents came out. I know some people wanted the two envelope to be still higher proportion on the design side, but anyway, at least I think the tender does provide some flexibility, albeit the judging is going to be very interesting. I mean, I don't know whether you want to comment on any of what Terence has been saying, or we can go on to just other PPP project approaches. So, look, in Hong Kong, we've seen that many of the projects here on the PPP basis, they have kind of public mission component, whether it's cyberport, whether it's hotel developments in a park around the airport. We've got Park Paramount and Airport Paramount. We've had Sports Park at Kai Tak, which has again a community sports content, and ACE with the West Kowloon with the arts and cultural. So how do these public mission aspects impact the feasibility of these projects? And you know, maybe comment a bit more on how we can overcome those difficulties.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you're definitely right. A lot of the, I guess, what Hong Kong would call PPP style projects in the past, I guess, in recent history, have included some type of community element or public space or cultural aspect or sporting, which definitely does, you know, impact the prosperity sometimes portion of the triple bottom line. I think there's probably, in terms of the Hong Kong context, 3 considerations, I guess, from what we've seen on these projects. The first is probably risk and the risk allocation in the models that we're seeing. Second is the alignment of the long-term interests, you know, the conflict between that community element and the you know, more commercial or revenue generating element. And then the third is around the market interest and market capacity. So maybe just first on the risk. So I think, you know, PPP projects in Hong Kong are probably a little bit different to what we've seen in other regions. PPPs traditionally have come about because governments have had an issue in terms of funding infrastructure projects or developments, so they need to rely on private sector finance. And then with that comes the innovation and of construction operations, and it has worked well in some areas and some not so great areas. But I think Hong Kong, because it hasn't had that funding challenge, has sort of approached PPPs in a little bit of a different context, I guess you could say. And then when you add that community or public aspect in with these other type of assets and try and combine them into the same project, it does create some tension and conflict. I think there is a general acknowledgement, I think, as we were sort of discussing on Site 3 and also Central Market, that these community aspects do need to almost be subsidised or cross-subsidised by the more commercial elements. It's just which is the main driver and how much that and to what extent that happens. I think what we've seen in Hong Kong for a lot of the projects, the risk in the contracts, I mean, Hong Kong government loves to transfer risk, a lot of it's sort of their default position. So when you throw in these, you know, aspects of projects that aren't as feasible, the risk balance it becomes imbalanced. And a lot of the projects we've seen and it require full revenue risk, and that does not necessarily sort of align. I mean, it's probably my second point, align with the long-term outcomes of what these projects are trying to achieve. So when you have, you know, a community, like, you know, sports park, you know, there's a huge community element, but they're, you know, also being able to offset with other events, etc., that generate revenue. I think for a lot of these, there just needs to be that consideration by government and procuring entities on which is the main driver, and then which model is fit for purpose for that driver. So I think we've seen in other jurisdictions a whole spectrum, you know, just from even in Hong Kong, you know, just outsourcing operations with no private finance, you know, all the way through to, you know, availability payments, or even Hong Kong loves BOTs. But, you know, when you have a huge community element, having a BOT with full revenue risk transfer is probably not an alignment of interest, because the private sector is incentivized to make as much money as possible, may not achieve the community outcomes. So maybe I think Hong Kong needs to probably, and the procuring agencies need to consider more of a partnership and risk sharing based approach.
Can you tell us a bit more about that, so in terms of other projects that you've seen, where what kind of risks should the public sector be more open to take or have taken? Are there any examples you can give, or maybe not specifics if you have to sanitize it?
Yeah, I think it does depend on the extent of the community element. If it is sort of like Site 3, where it's more of a public open space component, I think that that's sort of fine in terms of definition of how that works. But if it is a more of an asset that needs to be operated with a community element, then that requires, in order for the government to get what they want out of that, the specification and then also the financial support to achieve that. So whether that's you know, looking at levying other parts of the development and transferring that into a fund that's maybe co-administered by the private sector and the public sector to maybe get the outcomes together. You know, that's what worked quite well in other jurisdictions. Or then just changing the model in total to be more of an availability style PPP model, where you actually are, the government is specifying the clear outcomes, and then the private sector is paid on that basis to make sure they get the outcomes that they want. You know, there's a whole, you know, or even minimum revenue guarantees. So, you know, if the revenue in the community facilities drops below a certain amount, private sector isn't penalised for that. So I think there's a whole heap of options to be considered. They just haven't been considered or implemented in Hong Kong.
Okay. I mean, Donald, do you want to comment about what, you know, what would you be saying to government to try to be more open or flexible on some of these projects that you've seen?
I think I totally agree with. I mean, where the risk allocation need to be fair, and you know, it's really a partnership approach rather than allocating all the risks, you know, downstream. In a lot of the PPP projects, I think it is a very unique situation where the business model are uncertain to some extent, and therefore I think the risk sharing is important. You know, in my previous life as well, you know, in my role at China Camp, I have looked at various PPP projects, you know, from the very original West Kowloon Cultural District, you know, design development to the cruise terminal, where there was intention of inviting private sector to build and operate. Eventually, government stepped in and saying, thanks, we got all your ideas. Now we are going to do it ourselves.
Actually, the private sector, if I remember, said they didn't want to do it. So actually, government sort of felt that they then had to step in if they wanted it to happen.
Well, I think this is really, the trust is important. I think the government, in a lot of their consideration, they are afraid that they are giving too much advantage to the public sector. Therefore, they are, you know, putting in a lot of community requirements, while, you know, the profit-making part actually is insufficient to support, you know, the community operation. So there need to be a give and take there.
Yeah, but this is also where coming down to control, and one word is interference, another word is control between public sector and private. And any comments about the balance on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent, some assets, should not be combined with others in packaging. So the packaging itself needs to be looked at, you know, or sort of segments within a PPP package, because that long-term alignment is very hard to balance a highly commercial, you know, asset with a non-commercial asset in the same model, because it just doesn't. So I think considering the actual packaging, it becomes really important before you even get down to the next step in terms of operations.
But you see, that's going to be the difference. So site 3, for example, is right, developer wins the tender, they get on with it. Okay, you have your design development parameters and town planning and those kinds of aspects. Otherwise, it's your site, you get on with it. Your central market, you've got a joint committee, so you've got to work with all of these different stakeholders. But does private sector like to work with public sector in this
well, I won't speak for the private sector. I will speak for the sort of the market engagement that I've done, and there is a huge amount of interest locally and also internationally in the Hong Kong market, and also in the Asia market, because the growth is massive. And so I think the private sector has got, you know, they've got a lot of cash to invest. A huge amount of, you know, the risk environment is really good to invest in these types of projects from a long-term investment perspective. So I think the market appetite is there. It's just the government almost needs to be able to establish a good track record in this, in engaging that and that from a partnership approach.
But this is also how the world has completely changed, and this is not just Hong Kong in terms of political risk. Whether it's high-speed rail between Singapore and Malaysia, Hong Kong, mainland China, around blah, 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 okay, and you know, plenty, you know, Myanmar, you know, there's all kinds of Thailand has its own issues. So lots of political risk, which I think is now higher up on people's agendas and factoring in the feasibility of working together with public sector on some of these projects.
And termination provisions in contracts.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. What is fair as an outcome to the developer on the termination, which I think historically in Hong Kong is good luck. Thank you very much. Soon then we'll work out how it works out. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, it's quite interesting, because we've also experienced that previous project I won't name it in Hong Kong. It's quite interesting, the risk allocation between private and public. It's quite, I mean, we have that also in Singapore. And we used to joke, developers, we used to joke, oh, you know, the government gets it all. And until I came to Hong Kong, I'm just going to go back and tell them, you guys have it easier. You know, you look, so, I mean, Site 3 is a very good example. I think if you look at that site, it's covered by Type 2 infrastructure, and then you have a lot of things. Then you have to work with the authorities here, and just by working with one, it's already, you know, even by Singapore context, it's quite a lot of risk, because it tends to load on the time you can bring the product to market. So I think those things, even though it's not so apparent sometimes to some of us as designers, they do make a huge impact when you look at the viability of that. So I think it's not to forget that even though the developer takes everything, it is not an easy ride. There's a lot of people to talk to and work through.
But we've only got 2 minutes left, and I'm just trying to see if I haven't received any questions, Karen, unless you've received them separately. But if anyone has any very quick question, please do quickly add it into the chat. Let me have a quick look. Okay, so what are your thoughts on covering the General Post Office, because that on conserving the GPF because it's actually a sort of reprovisioning. Quick comment, Terence.
I mean, personally, I would
conserve.
I actually think that I think for any society, meaning is very important.
Yeah,
we are going through that in Singapore. It's a huge discussion on heritage, but we felt when we grew so fast, we forgot one. I mean, I grew up in Singapore every day. When I was in UK, every 2 years when I go back and start driving, I don't know how to get home because the roads were changing. And my mom was just telling me, you're so lost. So I think it's interesting, and I also think there is a lot that you can do. I mean, innovative with existing structures. Donald has explained very, very well, and a lot of the things is in the soft bits, and not changing physically. The whole. It's like a person. You know, you can do many things inside. You don't have to be going for infrastructure and all that stuff. So I think is to work with existing features, and you could create beautiful one.
I'm a great fan of I'm being radical here, and I'm just a lawyer, but when you look at the Louvre in Paris, and just that IMP pyramid of glass in the middle, and people go, well, it's horrendous, but actually it's fabulous and inspirational. And so to actually combine old and new together, to me, is really
flavor to the city, new and old. Yeah.
But okay, so quickly, last minute, if you were to say to government, what would you do to make things either work better for future projects? Quick comments. Emily, any sort of bits of advice you'd give to government?
I just think, we've got big things in the pipeline like Lantau tomorrow, Island South, huge initiatives, and sort of a holistic approach is really important, not just an engineering study that's done from a feasibility perspective, but, consider social, economics, procurement, finance, do it all together.
Okay, all right, Donald.
Well, partnership approach is important. We are on the same team.
Right.
We shouldn't be on opposite side.
Right, partnership. Yes, not. I've had someone say master slave. I shouldn't mention that. So partnership is a key word. Terence, any key
From
words?
a city urban design perspective, the sum of the parts should be more than the parts.
Okay.
I think it needs to be all connected.
Right. Okay. All right. Great. Look. Okay. Well, look. It's amazing how quickly 45 minutes goes. But thank you very much for sharing some great case studies from Central Market, Site 3, PPPs generally. Good to see Hong Kong government is at least trying to be a little bit more open and creative with that Site 3. Probably would have liked a bit more, but anyway, let's hope that we can have through whether it's ULI or others greater dialogue on how we can have more successful public-private partnerships that also have a good triple bottom line balancing people, planet, and prosperity for all. So there we go, including stakeholders. So thank you very much. Special thanks to my panelists, to ULI for hosting this series and this event. So wish you all a happy Easter to come. So have a good long weekend. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you.